You made it. You have it all, the life you want, except you're missing something. Welcome to The Guy Show, featuring the experts giving you the tips, tricks, and tutelage in wellness, lifestyle, and all things guy, and for the gals that love them. We're here to answer your questions and the things you want to know about. Welcome to The Guy Show.
This week's episode features Dr. Daniel Friedland. He helps businesses and healthcare organizations transform their leaders and people from stress and burnout into high-performing, innovative, engaged leaders and teams so they can take their organizations to the next level in the global competitive environment. His programs on leading well from within, conscious leadership, peak performance, and cultivating resilience in healthcare are evidence-based with a solid foundation in neuroscience, mindfulness practice, and are presented with a warm, engaging human touch.
Hey, welcome to the show, Dr. Daniel Friedland. Got your book right here, The Leading Well from Within. I mean, this book, I read it. I mean, I got dog tag here's on here enough to probably like a 3-hour show with you, but we won't go that deep.
Okay.
You got some special stuff for people with what you do with coaching, so we'll get to that too later on. But your book is amazing. I'm so happy to have you on the show finally. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jerry. Really appreciate being here and really appreciate all of you listening as well.
I think let's just dive into this bad book, because this is really an amazing book here. And really, I think the two big things I took from it was, there's so many things I took from it, but I think that beginning thing, like we were talking pre-show, was really that mindset that we have. And we tend to be in that reactive mindset, as you noted in your book, and then kind of the two tails of the mindset, and then into that creative mindset.
Yes.
And so what are those two things?
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can help, frame at a pretty high elevation. And just to set a context for the concept of the reactive and creative mindset. Mm-hmm. So the title of the book, Leading Well from Within, the premise is that if we want to lead well in the world, the first place we need to know how do we lead well inside ourselves? Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, how do we learn how to navigate stress, uncertainty, and self-doubt so that we can focus on what really matters, essentially leading from our higher selves. Mm-hmm. And the kicker of why this is so important is that when you look at leadership, and you define leadership's an act of influence. Mm-hmm. And really high performance, conscious leadership is having the capacity to influence the character and behavior of others for good. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the neuroscience around leadership, and the neuroscience around how we're wired to connect, we inevitably have influence on others. Mm-hmm. We cannot not have influence. And so the mindset that we show up with ripples out with emotional contagion into our environment. Mm-hmm. And so the mindset that you show up with, if you show up with a reactive, fear-based mindset, you will not only pull yourself into that fight and flight reactive domain with all the outcomes, both the emotional, the anger, the irritation, the withdrawal, mm-hmm. Or the thought stream, which is what if in every catastrophe that could happen, and what's wrong with me, what's wrong with others, and mm-hmm. the cascade of behaviors that are associated with that. But because we're in this reactive space, we actually take everybody else with us and we get them into a cycle of reactivity, and we create a cycle of disengagement around us. Mm-hmm. As opposed to when we learn the skills to understand how our brain works and the key skills and practices where we can elevate our capacity for leadership, engaging a creative mindset, mm-hmm. then we have the greatest capacity to do good creative work, deliver mm-hmm. meaningful, purposeful value, and make a significant difference in the world. So I've been fascinated by this, by these two mindsets, the science behind them, and how we can develop insight and awareness to understand how we oscillate between these mindsets in a very dynamic way, and mm-hmm. what are the key skills and practices with which we can use to shift from a reactive to a creative mindset for the benefit of ourselves and the benefit of our loved ones and everybody else that we serve.
Yeah. It's so true what you said in that process. When we're in that stress state, everybody around you can feel it. And when we're in that reactive, people can feel that, and it feeds. It's almost like sometimes when it's an addiction to that stress and that reaction that people get, and then they just keep feeding into that, and then it keeps that cycle going, so we never get to that creative phase.
Yeah, and it's profound. And part of, there's a whole physiological track when we feel threatened, and we go into and we trigger. A lot of this is mediated by what's called our automatic nervous system, or our autonomic nervous system, which is made up of two branches. One is the parasympathetic branch, which is like tapping the brake. It's when we can really tap the brake and we can stay kind of in the groove, if you will, you know, stay and play and rest and digest and feed and breed and pause and plan and just stay in that creative groove. And then the moment we feel judgment or criticism, or we make a mistake, or we beat up on ourselves, boom, we feel psychologically threatened. We'll go into fight and flight responses in a heartbeat, activating our sympathetic nervous system. And the key over here is that there is essentially science around how the nerves of the autonomic nervous system feed the muscles of the face and our voice box.
Yeah, totally. That happens there in that process when we're feeding that sympathetic system, that fight or flight response within there. Like you said, it just causes and wreaks so much havoc on people, and just keeps them going down that chain, and it's hard to break it. And you had mentioned that there's some steps that you can start with potentially to kind of break out of that reactive to get to that creativity space.
Indeed, there are some steps. Just coming back a little bit to take that one step further in terms of the sympathetic drive, is that we cannot hide our stress. That sympathetic response, because it feeds the muscles of our face and our voice box. That's why about 70% of what we communicate is nonverbal. So what happens is when people try to armor up and try to pretend that everything's okay, you can look at somebody and say, something doesn't feel right. And part of the micro expressions is a stony stare, heavy set jaw, losing the prosody of the voice. So our voice becomes very, very clipped. And what happens is that will immediately, that demeanor will immediately trigger, because we're wired to connect, it'll activate the amygdala, it'll trigger our fight and flight responses even before we know we do. And so we can cascade into the cycle of reactivity with others. That's why it's really important to learn how to actually self-regulate from the inside out. Again, lead well from within. And those skills are really important. It's not an external strategy. In fact, if you try to kind of strategically sound like everything's cool and, you know, say the things that are politically correct, but your physiology betrays you, it will actually magnify your inauthenticity and actually erode the trust. And so it needs to be really authentically activated. And part of that is learning how the steps is learning how to actually not only shift your mindset, but pragmatically know how to hack that physiology so that you can learn how to actually deactivate that stress response within seconds. And we know the skills and practices, many of the skills and practices that enables us to gain greater emotional composure and control in the heat of the moment. And that's what makes for a high performance leader.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part too for people is to break that cycle there, like you were saying, is learning that. But the research does show that when you can shift from there through multiple different ways, that allows the body to calm that down, get it more in that parasympathetic response, and then allow them to focus more and, like you said, become that leader within. Because a stressed leader is not a good leader, and we see that in today's society. A stressed out leader does not equate to a strong leader in any sense, in the sense of business or anything else there in that process. So yeah, definitely that shift and learning how to shift there, recognizing it, learning how to shift is really key through there. So is there some qualities or definite characteristics of each that would be a reactive versus a creative brain?
Yeah, and we'll go into that. I want to, if we can, Jerry, I'd love to just create a little bit of a placeholder as well with this thought, if we go deep in the conversation about the stressed out leader, because the science around this is that there are multiple types of stress responses.
Okay.
And there are certain kinds of stress responses, if you know how to leverage them, can actually elevate your performance. So the real question around stress is not whether you're a stressed out leader, but what kind of stress response are you channeling to greatest efficacy. And I'm happy to unpack that piece because it gets us into a whole new science of stress.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, yeah. So part of the science around this is really interesting. It really begins also with a fundamental understanding of knowing how your brain works.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many ways that you could break this down. One of the ways that you can approach this is with this concept of the triune brain, which is an evolutionary model of the brain where the brain develops from the bottom up and the back forward. This is put forward by Paul MacLean, head of the National Institute for Mental Health.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some neuroscientists, I will say, bristle at this. They say it's oversimplified. Yet I also think the simplification just has a lot of explanatory power as well. So without getting to the nuance and trying to dismantle the whole model, these pieces I think serve well. So the three parts of the triune brain are, if you use the hand model of the brain, the base of the first part of the triune brain is really the survival brain, represented by essentially over here by the wrist, you could say, and the parts of the reward circuitry over here. And MacLean called that the reptilian brain. Very much about safety and survival. When we threat, we're going into fight and flight responses in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. This middle part of the brain, unlike reptiles that lay the eggs and skedaddle, the middle part of the brain over here gives rise to the next part of evolution in mammals. Mammals suckle their young, nurture, very vulnerable infants. And so ultimately this gives rise to the pappalian mammalian brain, also known, collection of structures known as the limbic system.
Right.
And this really gets into essentially our primal drives, pursuit of food, water, sex, pair bonding. And then overly simplified, you've got a structure here, the amygdala, that folds over, which lays down emotional memory. So some people say, that this part of the brain, limbic system, really starts, evolving into affiliation, emotional memory. And then you've got the higher part of the brain, which is the neocortex. And we think about this as the seat of conscious awareness. Our ability to weigh the present, imagine a better future, be able to create a plan of action to get there. And many of the high performance leadership attributes, which is emotional composure, executive functions, including decision making, the capacity to relate well to people, mindful awareness, leverages the neocortex, and particularly behind the forehead over here, the prefrontal cortex in particular, which is the CEO of the brain. And when you look at the structure of the brain, essentially what it overlaps safety, affiliate, belonging, and significance. It really, the brain maps beautifully against Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Simplified to safety, belonging, and significance. Now, when you begin to appreciate that, and then you begin to overlay our relationship with stress, there are at least three key types of stress responses, and probably more, but at least three key ones. The threat response, which is the common way we think about stress, which is the fight and flight response to save our life in a short moment. We vasoconstrict, we release cortisol. That threat response pulls us into the safety domain.
Right.
So when we go down there, we actually go down to the safety domain. And if we do this over a chronic period of time, interesting enough, we end up going down to the safety frame. We become exhausted. We forego love and belonging. So we become disconnected, and we forego what gives us a sense of significance. And so we have this reduced sense of accomplishment. And those three areas, interestingly enough, that chronic unrelenting threat response, exhaustion, disconnection, or reduced sense of accomplishment, those are the hallmarks of burnout, the classification of burnout. So it explains that. But it turns out that you have at least two other stress responses. You have the tend and befriend response. And when we get stressed, you don't only release cortisol, you also release oxytocin, which is the cuddle chemical. Interesting enough, it's also considered the chemical of courage. And this enables you. So the feeling we have around this is there's a part of us in the threat response where we may either become overly aggressive or we isolate. But there may be another part when we get stressed, we want to reach out to a friend. And the question is, which stream do you swim in? Because you actually have two different kinds of stress response at play. And so the tend and befriend response elevates your capacity for leadership in cultivating greater social support. And then you've got a high performance stress response. It's actually called the challenge response. And the challenge response, in that response, you feel the energy of stress. And stress is just energy. You feel the energy of stress, but rather than saying, geez, I've got to get rid of it, you feel it and you're amped up and you're saying, I'm amped, let's go. It's go time. And instead of pushing the stress away, these high performers are using the stress in service of the outcomes that matter most. And the classic over here is the athlete in the Olympics, for example, gets to the start line and they're amped up and they're able to translate every ounce of that energy of stress from the start line to the finish line, the most likely to win, as opposed to athletes that, for example, are in the threat response, they over muscle or they become overly timid and they don't quite get there.
Right.
And so the capacity to actually engage this challenge response, and the physiology, by the way, changes in the challenge response. Instead of vasoconstriction, you vasodilate. You get more blood to the brain. You release more DHEA, which is like a miracle grow for the brain, if you will. And this is associated with all kinds of high performance outcomes, the challenge response, including business negotiations, academic performance, athletic achievement, even like pilots landing planes in flight simulations, even surgeons doing laparoscopic surgery, even recovery from childhood trauma. So a lot of this work for leaders is learning how to actually engage a healthy relationship with stress. Developing mastery to understand how to convert threat to challenge. So instead of caving under threat in times of high pressure and demand, you develop the capacity to rise to the challenge and perform at even higher levels. And again, because we're wired to connect, if you as a leader can do that, you can infect your team, as it will, with this challenge response, where as an organization, you rise to the challenge. And as a result, you outperform, on all of your key performance indicators. So it's, it's pretty exciting work when you get deeply into this.
Yeah. And it's interesting to, if I quantify that a little bit, that those people that can adapt to that second and third level are the higher performers in life overall versus the ones that get stuck in that initial fight or flight and stay in there.
Yes.
So I think that's that adaptability, and some of the research for like Navy SEALs and the high performance operators like that they're seeing is those that can go to that second and third level, particularly the third level in that process there, are the ones that get through the training, get through that process and perform really well versus the ones that stay in that fight or flight and then collapse, like you were saying.
Exactly. And so these teams are, outperformed because they know when the pressure, when everything in terms of the external pressures and demands are likely to push them down into a safety frame, they know how to actually, they've got the competence to meet their safety needs as best as they can, as well as leverage the incredible sense of trust that they have within the team, and then to retain the possibility for actually creative action that allows them to actually go even further and deliver, innovative results.
And get, like you said, get from that reactive to creative mindset there, that second and third level, as you noted, gets them more to that creative set versus stuck in that resistant or that stressed out mindset through there. The hierarchy that, like Maslow's hierarchy, the pyramids that you have in the book, that from reptilian brain on up through the process, and that, even though, like you said, there's some argument that it's too simplified or anything like that, that's the perfect way to describe it. And in an academic setting, or, you can go deeper into the nuances, like you said, but really that 3-level process makes so much sense and is easy for people to understand and get results with.
Exactly. And what I find is that when you have concepts that have explanatory power, there's an adage that essentially all models are wrong. Are they useful enough for implementation? And what I found in the work that I do in my workshops and my coaching is that what this understanding provides is an understanding that catalyzes action, that ultimately yields results. And that's more than anything. What's gratifying to me is that this understanding, first of all, destigmatizes, people's stress around having stress, helps them more deeply understand it, gives them some practical footholds of insight that lead to practical behavior that creates positive outcomes.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a perfect lead-in, because you do coaching, you do seminars and things like that. So let's talk about the process. Let's talk about your stuff that you do as far as that coaching and guidance and those things.
Yeah, with pleasure, and you know, I'm happy to share with you in a way, because I imagine that a lot of folks listening right now are leaders. And in fact, well, let me actually clarify that everybody listening is a leader.
Exactly.
If leadership is an act of influence, ultimately, we lead at every moment, you know, of the day, in every capacity we have, wherever we actually touch somebody else. If we have a formal leadership position in a business, we lead. If you're actually an individual contributor and you touch the culture of your organization, you lead. If you're a parent, you certainly lead. If you're a coach, consultant, teacher, you lead. If you write a Facebook post, which ripples out into ether, you lead. If you actually pick up your laundry, the way you touch somebody. So we lead in every which way, and actually even taking that further, because we're wired to connect, and you understand that you cannot not have influence. What that means is leadership is not even an act of becoming a leader. It's awakening to the leader you already are. Because the only question you're having is, are you having positive or negative influence?
Right.
And with that responsibility, or how are we developing our capacity to lead from our higher selves? So in that context, my coaching philosophy is one, that if I can serve really well, ultimately what I'm doing is I'm coaching others to self-coach themselves. And then I'm teaching them how to self-coach, how to coach others to self-coach themselves. So if you have an organization, you actually create this intrinsic activation from the inside out of the organization, because individuals are internally lit with capacity. Yeah. And so when I work with, in my coaching engagements, it's a 6-month engagement, because it takes time to really do meaningful work, especially if you're working around transforming, creating high performance habits, which engages neuroplastic brain change. So there's an arc of the coaching that's customized around the mastery of the leading well from within curriculum. Highly customized. The secret source of the coaching, though, is I'm on call 24/7 for my clients. And the reason is that if the premise is about supporting others to cultivate their capacity for self-coaching, in developing the capacity to lead from their higher selves, if you will, to elevate within that Maslowian structure from the reactive safety frame into the greater capacity to enrich relationships in the belonging frame, and then to be visionary, strategic, high-performing leaders within the significance frame. Ultimately, we're talking about what is your capacity for elevation. Now, there's a formula that I find incredibly powerful. And the formula that actually really dictates whether or not somebody's going to cave under threat or rise to the challenge is a simple formula of what is the relationship of the demands you're facing in your life to the resources you have to engage.
Makes sense.
And if the demands outstrip resources, you will cave under threat. If, on the other hand, resources meet or exceed demands, you'll be able to rise to the challenge. So what I do in my coaching essentially is I help leaders become more internally resourceful with some of the best skills and practices that I can find to empower individuals with mindset shift, to be able to tap their inner resources to rise the channel, and then marshal external resources in their relationship to do that collectively as well. Now, in the heat of the moment, when a client calls me in a moment of duress, and I really encourage them to call me at a very low threshold, to call me in that moment of crises, if you will, the learning moment, because that's the beautiful moment where we actually learn, where individuals learn, even where our standing calls are an hour long. But these calls can be 10 or 15 minutes. And you work through an issue, and what individuals learn is they learn their capacity for elevation in the moment. If essentially they're calling me initially looking for a peripheral prefrontal cortex, because when their demands exceed essentially exceed their resources. And these are very, very smart business leaders.
Oh, yeah.
Business owners, CEOs, director, senior vice presidents, very smart individuals. It's just that in the heat of the moment, when they've gone limbic, if you will, they go into their safety frame, they lose access to their clear thinking.
Totally.
But if they can learn in the heat of the moment how to bring their capacity back online, they develop tremendous resilience.
Yeah. And I think you nailed that aspect right there perfectly, is that and it hit me and I started chuckling. I don't know if you saw that, was that peripheral prefrontal cortex.
Yes.
Is that you have this other person who has their cortex rocking and their prefrontal cortex rocking and rolling, ready to help you in that process, versus, like you said, they revert, that just shuts down, goes to that limbic system, goes to that fight or flight amygdala response within there. Right. It allows them to be able to go, hey, here's this, I have this stressor, versus stressing about it for a long period of time because our call's not till next Tuesday. You know?
Exactly. And there's a very funny quote that goes, for breakfast, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed.
Yeah.
Right? So from a coaching perspective, because, I can actually, it's not my life, but I have a lot of compassion for the life of somebody else. I'm able to maintain that prefrontal cortical perspective, but when somebody's bacon is on the line and they're in it, they're highly predisposed to go into their limbic system. And even though they might be able to even coach somebody to basically elevate if it wasn't them in that moment, that extra bit of support, not only to actually help them rise in that moment, but actually develop their strength to rise in future similar moments, to actually rehearse, almost like the Navy SEALs rehearse in that moment, or actually take, what's on deck, develop mastery with that. Then what comes next becomes easier to engage. And here's how it works. Let me share with you the specifics. Almost pull back the kimono, if you will.
Yeah.
Just,
let's get naked here.
Yeah, exactly. Right on. Okay. So the first thing that I do, coming back to this Maslowian hierarchy, safety, belonging, significance. I know when demands exceed resources, people are caving under threat. They're calling me because they want to leverage me as a peripheral prefrontal cortex. My coaching is not simply to give solutions, but to actually support them in having their higher cortical circuits come back online so that they can experience their self-efficacy in the moment. And so the way I do this is, the first thing I do, you can set a clock to this. I listen with compassion. I listen with heartfelt compassion. And I'm not reinforcing unhealthy behavior. I'm simply listening from compassion, because the person who I'm working with is genuinely going through suffering in the moment. And I let them tell their story, and they'll call me and they say, look, my stress level is 12 out of 10. And then just by telling their story in a container of compassion, within 3 or 4 minutes, as you can imagine, that stress level will come down to a 6 out of 7. And the reason is that actually, as they tell their story, first of all, they're no longer in their story, but by telling it, they're rising above their story. And they're feeling this container of compassion, which is helping them rise to this belonging frame. And then when we're down to when you can feel the temperature, and it's because it's, this is biological, it's highly predictable. And as we feel into this moment where actually the heat of the moment comes down, I'll pause. I'll say, how are you feeling? That's how I feel. I feel like something's lifting off my shoulders right now. And then I'll say, I'll ask them a question. I say, well, why? I just feel like, I have this opportunity to tell my story. And I'll ask them, do you feel that I'm being compassionate with you right now? And the heart of compassion is the heart of resiliency. And I'm not asking them for my feedback. I'm asking them for their awareness. And what I mean by that is, when they say, yes, I feel you being very compassionate right now, very empathetic. I say, why do you think I'm being compassionate, empathetic with you? And they say, well, I'm hearing the tone of your voice and the warm, affirming words that you're using. So the reason why I want to bring that light of awareness is to remind them to actually bring that same quality of tone and affirming words to their internal dialogue, so they can model that behavior and now internalize that and actually reflect that inwards. So they develop the capacity in these moments. They develop the capacity for self-kindness, for self-compassion, which gives a leader tremendous resiliency, especially in times of risk.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now we're ready to shift from the belonging frame to the most powerful frame of all, because once we've claimed that ground, once we've claimed that next stable ground, building on safety and self-compassion, now you can claim the ground of significance. And you can't get there without going through those levels, because if I go straight to a solution, people will resist. Once you've claimed that ground of belonging inside yourself, then we nudge into significance. And the magic question that I ask is, so what are the outcomes you'd most like to see in the situation? What are the outcomes you'd most like to see? And I watch for the eddy current where people say, I want to be right. And I say, well, it goes back into the ego. I said, well, would you rather be right? Would you rather be happy?
Right.
And so we shift off, kind of an ego drive, and we look at what are your deepest, what is the deepest wish in this? And oftentimes it's about reconnecting with a relationship. I've worked with some of my clients, for example, haven't spoken to their children for 3 years. And all of a sudden they find their way back to the track and they reconnect. And they actually say, I want to reconnect in this relationship. Or they want to move towards, what feels like an overwhelming goal, a very big stretch. And they're saying, I need to figure out how to get there to meet this aspiration. And once they say that, they mention the outcomes, then I ask the question, I said, what are the smallest steps you can take in alignment with that outcome? And then there's a magic response. And the magic response is, well, maybe I could do this. And the moment they say, maybe I can do this, they're tickling their prefrontal cortex and their higher cortical circuits coming online, because the amygdala and the safety frame really essentially responds to problems. That's the problem frame. The moment you go into maybe I can do this and you begin to imagine possibilities, you're now in an outcome frame and elevated thinking. And then they go, well, maybe I can do that. And then it cascades and the energy shifts. And all of a sudden, within 10 to 15 minutes in the call, by the end of it, as that momentum gets going, I say, well, how are you feeling now? They say, wow, I feel completely different right now. I'm feeling, 2 or 3 out of 10 in stress. I've got clarity about my next steps. And I say, well, what's different? And the revelation is, ultimately, I've learned I can be kind to myself. And I'm understanding that when I actually focus more on solutions than on problems, I can elevate my thinking. And once they develop mastery for themselves, they understand how they can begin to coach others effectively. And by the same token of what I've shared you in the way I coach, leaders learn how they can similarly coach their teams in situations of high demand and scant resources to be able to rise to the challenge together by cultivating a team of greater trust and collaboration. And then a team that has the capacity to ask the right questions to elevate to an outcomes, solutions frames of thinking in alignment with the highest purpose, mission, and values of the organization, rather than the complaint around, the victimization sometimes teams feel around whatever difficulties they may face.
Yeah, I think you hit such a key point there. I had to keep it in my mind because it was a little bit back there, but in that coaching process is seeing the vision, but what are those small steps?
Yes.
What are those simple or small steps that need to be done or can be done that the person can see to get to where they want to go? Because as entrepreneurs, as CEOs, as business owners, as we see this gigantic vision, or we have this gigantic vision, and it scares us, which is good. But it also, we get lost in we get lost in the steps to get there.
Exactly. And people oftentimes get paralyzed in that gap of aspiration. As you said, it can be so large. So what I've got in addition in the book, the book, the first part of the book, it's a 3-part book. And actually,
the book,
I'm just looking over at my stash. For those that actually feel intimidated by the actual big version of the book, I did write the book summary.
The Cliff Notes version.
The Cliff Notes version, that and that's available on Amazon, or you can go to Super Smart Health if you're interested. You can download a free first chat, the introduction over there if you're interested in that. But the power of this for individuals to take these skills and practices, that first part of the book deals with essentially the foundation for high performance conscious leadership. Talking about what do we know about the science of these high performance characteristics, low performance characteristics. What do we know about the neuroscience of high performance leadership? And I talk about the foundation of mindful awareness, mindfulness as being a core foundation of conscious leadership. And then where I go is I offer people a 4-step framework to proactively shift between a reactive and a creative mindset. It's called the 4-in-4 framework. And within that framework, and it's on the foundation of mindfulness, I go through the core skills that help you effectively navigate stress, focus on what really matters, and then catalyze your growth. And the step that helps you focus on what really matters to achieve your vision is a process that I created, which is inspired by the way that I've seen the way that Cisco runs all their projects on something called vision, strategy, execution. So I adapted and I created a process called vision, strategy, implementation, and results. That's a very powerful circular process that you can use to optimize your health, your relationships, and the meaning, significance, and productivity of your work. And so part of that process will help individuals lean into their gap, of their aspiration gap, clarify their vision, and actually before I go to my strategic implementation plan, and then clarify what are the KPIs, the SMART results, specific, measurable, aligned. The A is alignment to your vision, realistic and time frame results that really serve as stepping stones to the vision. And once you've clarified your SMART results, then you look at what are my key strategies, and what is my being very meticulous on implementation track all the way into the calendar to actually meet those results. And then it iterates again. If you actually miss the KPI, or you let's say if you hit the KPI, you'll still refine this. But if you miss the KPI, you come back to reflect on your vision, your strategy, your implementation, whether the results were realistic to begin with. And that holds you on a cycle of continuous life improvement and performance.
Perfect. That's such a perfect way to do it too, is how you laid that out with the 4 things there, your 4-step 4-in-4 process there, that so many people miss in there. We get the vision, we get like the initial thing, but we don't get the KPIs in there. We don't get the things in there to make sure we're still sticking to that vision, to feed that cycle. And if we miss it, that 4-step process allows us to swing back around and go, where did we miss it at? And how do we now implement something new to make sure we hit that?
Yeah. And just not to confuse folks, it's called the 4-in-4 framework because there are 4 large steps that help you shift from reactivity to creativity. And then within each of these steps, there are 4 components to each step. So I just shared with you something called the VSIR, which are the 4 components of step 3 of that model.
Yeah. Your process is amazing. Your book is amazing. I went through it before. I got it 2 months ago when we scheduled the show, and went through. And like I said, I have a bunch of dog tag, ear tag notes and everything else that we're implementing in our lives already too. And with our practices and our businesses too. And so, where can people get in touch with you?
Wonderful. Well, easiest way is through my website, supersmarthealth.com. However would be, when I work with my clients, the premise that I always work with is everything's highly customized. So mostly what I want to do is I want to really learn, deeply what people's needs are, or interests, or aspirations, or frustrations. And then we customize around that. And I do everything from keynote addresses to in-depth immersive workshops. And then probably the deepest version of this work is the coaching as well. So, welcome to there's a contact us page over there, and I will be very responsive to that. I also welcome people to connect with me on LinkedIn. Be a joy to connect with with any of you listening right now as well. So I welcome that opportunity. Thank you for asking, Jerry.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Daniel Friedland, thank you for being on the show today. It's been amazing. Your tips, tricks, and tutelage and everything. I know we kept it basic in that sense, but we broadened it so much for people to really understand that mindset process and how we can get out of that reactive to the creative mindset within there, and some simple steps they can start with. But definitely go get his book, Leading Well from Within, the Neuroscience and Mindfulness-Based Framework for Conscious Leadership. Go to his website, get on his list, hire him to help you, because he will rock your world and get you out of that mindset. He is that, like you said earlier, you're that peripheral prefrontal cortex that we all need to be able to bounce that, regurgitate our stuff, get it out, and then bring us back to where we're going through it, answering the questions for ourselves along with your guidance through there. You laid it out in such a perfect way there. I'm really appreciating for you to be on the show today.
Well, thank you, Jerry. And just the way you summarize at the heart of that. And Jerry, just thank you so much for the work that you do. I mean, you're bringing so much just immense value to your listeners as well. So just deep respect and appreciation for everything you're doing as well. And thank you for the invitation. And thank you for all of you listening as well.
Well, thank you again. And we will catch you all later on the next episode.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of The Guy Show. What do you think? Register and post your review of this episode in iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or Google Play. Also, do not forget to set the auto download feature for the show. Be sure to like and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Guy Show Live. To get the most of this week's episode, be sure to check out the show notes at theguyshow.net, where you will find a free download of the tips, tricks, and tutelage from all of our guests and the host, plus many more amazing products, life-changing courses, and Guy Camp quarterly retreats that are available for your purchase.